Hello and good morning, everyone. Today I'm intrigued to have a panel of people, experts in an area which has been constantly in my conversations for the last 1.5 years with pharma companies, which is the omni-channel marketing and measurement effectiveness around it. It's a topic that's been ranging in pretty much all conversations that we've had. It's the hottest topic out there. And I'm sure our panelists who are in their own journeys today in the same environment would have a lot to share. So on the panel with me, I have some really exciting professionals who've been on this journey. Jane Urban from Otsuka, Brandon Drew from UCB, Daniel Kuo from Takeda, and Suresh Singh from Janssen. Folks, welcome. And I would like you to introduce yourself quickly so that our panel can get initiated. Jane, maybe we start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, my name is Jane Urban, and I lead customer engagement operations for Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. That's a combination of omni-channel plus data and analytics plus kind of commercial operations. So really bringing together all the customer engagement functions within one roof.
Brandon?
Yeah, thanks, Nitin. And I'm with UCB. I've been with UCB in a variety of roles over the last 16 years. I lead the Insight to Impact team for UCB in the US, which is very similar to, as Jane described, combining that customer engagement with traditional sales operations, data and analytics, really taking insight, whether that's patient or scientific understanding, and figuring out how to reach our customers to have the greatest impact. We also have embedded our finance team, as well as omnichannel digital marketing within that ecosystem. So it's really just a great collaboration among a lot of different teams in the customer engagement space.
Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Nitin. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel. I head up next-gen customer engagement for the Europe and Canada region in Takeda. I've been in the role since January of this year. And really, the scope of my responsibilities is, again, around customer engagement in its many shapes and forms, particularly in omnichannel, but also the underlying capabilities that support that from a product and technology point of view.
Suresh?
Yeah. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Before I begin, I just have to say that what I say here is my personal view and not the official position of J&J. But yeah, as most of the panelists here, I lead our customer engagement, AI products and strategy organization within our North America commercial strategy and operations team at Janssen. So I lead a team of business product owners, data scientists, data engineers, and we work extremely closely with our commercial leaders to identify the business challenges and then develop the technology and implement products and solutions and drive change management to help address those challenges across marketing, sales, patient services, medical affairs, and managed care. But so far, the focus of my team has disproportionately been on HCP Omnichannel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you can see that there is a ton of experience right here on this panel, people who are dealing with this tremendous transformation that pharma companies are having. Omnichannel, I think that's a topic which is up for debate in many forums, right? From what omnichannel's definition is, right, and to the fact that COVID actually propelled a huge amount of digital investment in this area, and whether we are talking about how information is disseminated, how we are engaging with our HCPs. On channels and with content that they want, where they want it. There has been a ton of investment that pharma companies have made. On the other side, in a recent interview that we conducted with the HCPs, 62% still feel that there is work to be done. They are not yet satisfied with the kind of personalization they are experiencing, the kind of content, channels, etc. So there is still definitely some work out there which is remaining. Now, the question is, with the amount of investment, I think one basic question that is coming up is, how do you calculate the ROI? What is the measurement framework? Is analytics truly driving it, right? And that's the topic of our conversation today. So just having set the context for the conversation, I'm looking for a very lively, interactive discussion here today. Let me start with the first question. So let's start with the basics, right? In your view, where do you think the omnichannel measurement journey is? Omnichannel journey has been there forever, for some time now, but where is the measurement journey in your view? And what are some of the goals and objectives and the ROI that your organizations are looking at? Brandon, maybe we start with you, and then you are the first one on my screen, and then we'll go over the horn.
Yeah, you loaded a lot into that question, and I think for a few years we started with the tactics, and it was really those different tactics implemented across, and we implemented them with different agencies and through different vehicles, and it makes the reporting and measurement and driving that consistency, very much a challenge. And I think we've shifted over time to a recognition that starting with the data and starting with how that data is connected and how these different channels are connected into that customer journey in order to really be able to define and compare tactics across. How effective are we being? Because it's not, we can look at how effective we are across digital channels, but we also need to be able to compare how effective we are to some of our non-personal, other non-personal and in-person promotion, and that is really what has started to take hold and what we've been doing as of late. And that requires a really strong understanding of the customer journey. What is it that we're trying to help, whether that is a patient or physician that we're communicating with? What is the problem we're trying to help them solve? And how effective are the different vehicles we are using at helping them to solve that? And that really is what starts to get to measuring that impact that you're having with each of these tactics and being able to compare them across.
I agree. I think that's a very well defined, at least the objective articulation. Jane, you are in the midst of this journey. What's your view right now from a measurement perspective?
Yeah, no, I think Brandon described it very well. That was a lot of question and a really great comprehensive answer. I think, to your point, Brandon, you get to a place where you're able to start to see the trade-off between different ways of engaging with customers, right? If you can build out a kind of a promotional marketing mix and establish essentially where your ROI is by different approach. I think that's right in itself a huge lift, and a lot of data has to go into that, and a lot of nuance and kind of understanding and decision-making about business rules, lag times, all of these different things have to also be at play. I think the other thing I've been starting to talk about is flipping it a little bit and saying, could we believe that there's a certain percentage of value being generated? Like, could we believe that 1% of our sales are coming from all of this work we're doing? And what does that look like relative to the investment we've made in this capability? I think that kind of conversation sometimes can soften a bit of the precision that is sort of asked for when you're talking about measurement, because the reality is it all comes together, right? There's a bit of a kind of combined externalities that make this more valuable or less valuable because of the way that physicians interact with all the different channels at the same time in some cases. So I think part of measurement is a bit of both, right? There's this bottoms up detailed build, and then there's kind of a top down view of, does this seem plausible? The amount of investment we put in is reasonably close to the amount of value we're getting out. And then moving on from there to start to look backwards, I think once you've launched, and see if you can see kind of that step change from adding different capabilities over time. And that may be the other way to kind of finally put a closure on the question of whether it's a good investment or not.
I think that's the question which is resonating across the board, right? What is it, that 1% lift, and how do you measure that? Daniel, your views on that?
Yeah, I think a lot's been mentioned, and I agree with everything that has been raised. We see it as sort of a pyramid, if you will, where you ladder up from, I think Brandon mentioned tactics. Yeah, absolutely, right? You have leading indicators, you have lagging indicators. Your lagging indicators are really where your revenue uplift happens, where cost savings are driven. But it starts with the tactics, right? And so you have your standard engagement level type metrics, you've got conversion type metrics, you've got as you ladder up, as I mentioned, it gets trickier and trickier to link those leading indicators to those lagging indicators. But that's what we're here for. That's the nut to crack, and I think a challenge for all of us when it comes to business cases. And but the good news is, I think omnichannel is, very well recognized and is here to stay. So we have that going for us.
I agree with you. I think 4 years back, I remember we used to hear, do we even need it? I think that question is not there anymore. It is about how much and how do you measure. So Suyash, I know you are in the midst of many things here. What's your perspective on that question?
Yeah, no, I think Jane, Brandon, and Daniel covered most of it. The only thing I would say, and the way you phrased the question, Nitin, was like the omnichannel journey is ongoing, and how does the omnichannel measurement journey fit into this, right? So if you look at the omnichannel journey, yes, we at some point we had the multi-channel approach where we used to engage HCPs via different channels, personal promotion, rep emails, banners, HQ, third party, EHR, text, social. As that is evolving, we do have a lot of data for some of these channels historically to be able to do the marketing mix, but for the new channels and the coordination, the level of coordination that we are attempting for the channels for which we do not have a historical precedence, I think a challenge then becomes how do we quickly show whether tactics are working or not, and the coordination is working or not. So to your point, I think it is kind of a given that omnichannel works, but I don't think it's been established that what's the level of coordination that is required and the synchronization and the orchestration that is required, and where it becomes a bit of an overkill when we look at coordinating across the different channels. So that's the cutting edge of what we are, I think the industry overall is trying to do in terms of measurement.
You actually set me up for my next question, which I think is the most important question, I think, in my view. It requires a significant amount of process change. It requires a significant amount of skill upliftment, right? There are different, people are used to working in their own lanes, but now you are asking them to coordinate with others. And that means the talent, way you stitch these teams together has to change, right? I wanted to get your views on what strategies are you adopting to bring this orchestration together. This is a game that many have to play like a team sport, right? And pharma organizations have been good in doing things in their own silos, but when it comes to getting it together, there's a challenge. So I'll flip the order this time. So Yash, we'll start with you. You talked about this very important topic. Let's hear your views on that. How are you going about it?
Yeah, so I think change management is key, like as we go down this journey, right? So the way that I think the industry overall kind of looks at it is fivefold, right? So we look at change in technology, the changes in process, the change management at a leadership level as a whole, upskilling of the existing talent, and then finally hiring new talent, right? So I'll quickly go through a couple of those. But in terms of like changes in processes, as you mentioned, Nitin, overall, we look at how do we actually look at the investments in the capabilities centrally in terms of capital investment versus something that will be OpEx going forward, and how do we put the business proposition appropriately to have a balance between internalization of assets and capabilities versus having external partners do it, right? So that's been kind of a discussion that I'm hearing across the board, across the industry as well. The second one is like overall change management. One thing that, in my experience, we have learned that all of this cannot be like a central top-down COE initiative. And we need to ensure like consistency in metrics across the different partners, different media agencies, brands, and elevate these in regular meetings with the senior leaders so that they feel part of the journey and they champion this as we kind of like pitch for EHR or text or social or something that has not been done before. And then the last one I would touch upon is the hiring of new talent. So being very mindful of the job descriptions that we post across the board, right? Incorporating the element of digital, working with the different organizations who may not be part of the analytics organization to be part of the interview panel, look for non-traditional, non-pharma talent from retail, CPG, digital marketers, media agencies to see how we can create that talent pool to be able to support something that we are exploring internally. So I'll take a pause there, but that's how I would put it: like change in process, change management, upskilling of internal talent, and hiring of external talent.
Very comprehensive. Jane, you are building a new team. You've joined in Suka recently. How do you resonate with the things that?
Yeah, no, and totally resonate. So I've been at Otsuka now about 2 months. Actually, previously I spent about 7 years at Takeda, worked with Dan a little bit there. I would say that one of the other things is just making sure that amongst every stakeholder that may have to interact with the omni-channel space, they're able to understand the terminology, they can get those kind of basic questions out of the way. That actually I'm building a set of capabilities to train and upskill the marketing team, the sales team, the market access team. So you really have to think about the entire ecosystem of the commercial organization when it comes to the people and the talent. You don't have to replace everybody by any stretch. It's usually very easy for folks to start to glom on to the value proposition of having multiple touch points. And I think I would also add that the customer has changed, right? Our clinicians that we talk to are much more comfortable in the digital space than they ever have been. And so that's also part of what we need to do to evolve, is kind of meet our customers where they are. And clinicians, just like us, are very much gotten used to working in virtual environments and having interaction in digital and in places like this webinar, right? So I think that's a bit of what we're also looking at, is how do we bring that's a skill, right? To be able to present and talk to people on a virtual platform. So those are also things that when we think about change management and talent development, those are things we have to bring to the table across field teams and the marketing teams as well. And the final thing I would add is just that there's such a, I think, important mix of internal people who know the company really well, and then external folks who bring expertise and experience from other places and other, companies, finding the right balance between those two, because you do, of course, need to bring in new thinking from outside if you haven't done this before, but you also need to make sure it's tailored and like designed around your company and their ways of working and culture as well, so that you're not trying to push too much change too fast for the organization. So I think that's something else to throw in there, is that balance of internal and external talent that you have on your team.
Very well said. I agree with most of the points made. Daniel, shifting to you, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, a lot's been said already. I don't have much more to add, although I agree completely that the change management aspects are probably the hardest parts of the transformation journey. The technology, the processes, those can all be defined, aligned, etc. I think the adoption is, particularly with people, I think is the hardest bit. And it's not just about the skills and upskilling people, it's also about the mindset shifts and the ways of working and getting people to believe in the reason why. Now, luckily, I think in the space that we work in with COVID and everything that amplified because of COVID, the reason why is much more obvious, I think, right? And requires much less explanation. And so then the question is, well, is that enough to get you to change in the way that you work and the knowledge that you have and the skills required in order to work in this new model?
It's always the minds and the hearts, right? Like getting them together, understanding the vision. Brendan, in our conversation before this panel, you talked about the very interesting way UCB has gone about creating this whole team together. I'm sure you will have a lot of perspective to share on this topic.
Yeah, we've learned a lot through the process, and I think some of the things that Jane, especially you touched on. What we've learned is the importance of not just bringing in people from outside, which is very important, bringing in external perspectives, as it has been mentioned. But it's not about bringing in a few all-star players. It's not a basketball team. We can't put a couple of players on the court and make a huge difference. We underestimated the importance of bringing the existing teams along and the effort that was required for that. And we're starting to get a better feel for the pace that we can move at. And not all teams, as Nitin, as we talked about previously, not all teams are at the same spot, and we need to recognize and understand where they are, where their customers are, and how to meet them where they're at to start to make some incremental steps towards what can be greater impact. I think we're in a good spot now with the people that we have on the team, and the recognition that it's not all about just having the expertise. It's about how that is shared, how we are upskilling the talent that we have, and really taking that change management to heart, not just applying a framework and expecting it to kind of happen, but really engaging and making sure that when communication is done, or when training is conveyed, or when we're sourcing for information, that there's a true that we're actually getting to that understanding, and it takes a lot more time than people really anticipate. But once you see it really come together and see it working, and people start, at that mindset shift that Daniel talked about, you really, I mean, it really starts to drive some momentum within the organization. So it starts to get people excited about it.
Very well said. I completely agree. I think that's the internal versus external, the right skill sets together, the common vision. I think those are very important. That brings me to another important thing that we see organizations struggling with. It's the cold start problem, and one can look at it in just data or availability or not availability in the rightful formats. But I would expand the definition of cold start in terms of, say, brands at different level of maturity who are part of this omnichannel journey. One is big, one is yet to start people. So how do you address that cold start problem? That's another thing that we see everywhere as companies try to stitch enterprise-wide omnichannel capabilities. That's a big issue. So I'll flip the order this time. We'll start with Daniel. Daniel, how do you respond to this cold start problem?
That's you gave me the hardest question. Look, I mean, like, you need to start somewhere, right? And so certainly you don't want to introduce advanced AI-driven next best action capabilities to teams that don't have any data, right? And so you might introduce those with the teams that have taken a more concerted and strategic effort towards defining data standards, structuring that data, making sure that they have an abundance of that data driven through omnichannel and the collection of said activity. But that is where you need to start, unfortunately, right? The cold start problem doesn't just go away because everybody's agreed that omnichannel is important, right? And so if everybody does agree that omnichannel is important, and they do have ambitions to get to data-driven, personalized engagement using technologies, things like AI and machine learning to aid in that, then they have to put in the hard work to build those foundations from a data perspective in order to make that happen. I mean, even with the example of next best action, right? The approach that we've taken in Takeda, and in particular in this region, is not to go straight to machine learning and AI, because we frankly don't have enough data to come up with really good suggestions that we would feel confident in putting in front of our field. So it's really trigger based, right? Because that's at the moment, because those are things where you can really think through what can you do with the data that you have available, as opposed to having lofty dreams around the next generation of customer engagement.
Yep, I agree. Jane, I know you are currently in similar problems, right? How are you addressing that? What are the approaches that you're taking?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Dan, with the data. You have to kind of pick up a shovel and find the best data you can with what you already have going on. But picking very specific use cases, making sure you have a very clearly defined problem that you're trying to solve, I think goes a long way. Understanding the patient journey very deeply, really knowing where customers are coming from and where they're going and where the decision pathways are for the physicians. Those are all prerequisites that you can do in the absence of building out all of the detailed decisions and engine sort of pieces for next best action, for example. I would say from a people side, the other thing is finding a coalition of the willing, I call it, people who are genuinely excited about wanting to do this is a great place to start. It may or may not be the most critical strategic part of your business. I think that's also important to keep in mind. Sometimes it works out that the most excited group is also the group that has the most kind of strategic importance, but sometimes it isn't. And I actually think in some ways, you know, we've kind of started with a group that was not the biggest or the most sort of like immediately obvious group to focus on in the organization, but it allowed us to have some safer space to really work on it and to get it right. I think there's also an element of the kind of business life cycle management here to keep in mind as well, because omnichannel is going to look a little different when you're talking about a launch brand versus a brand that's fairly well established versus a brand that's maybe nearing the end of its life cycle and would like to see some value extracted that way. So tailoring that cold start to the asset that you're thinking is going to be one of your picks might also be helpful. And then drawing from my experience in the US at Takeda about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I would say that also involved getting as many stakeholders involved as possible across the business unit. So both finding places to start that are willing and excited, but then putting some skin in the game from as many parts of the organization as you can so that there's more interest and momentum around it to really expand it and bring it across the portfolio. You kind of do all those things. It's a little tricky, but I think that can help kind of get the cold start to roll forward and get from that sort of risk-based, like, fine, I'll give you some money to try this mentality, to the demand-based, where people are saying, when do I get my decision engine? When can I do next best action? You kind of need to kind of have that first mover, and then ideally have a whole bunch of different stakeholders involved to get the momentum going.
Wonderful. So Yash, I know you are dealing with a lot of aspects of this, especially on the tech innovation side. There is a ton of work that you guys are doing. How are you looking at this cold start problem?
Yeah, I think Jane and Daniel kind of covered everything on the cold start for Omnichannel. I'll try and address like the cold start problem for when we actually deploy the Omnichannel in terms of the metrics and the measurement side, right? So even for the brands that are established brands, if we deploy the Omnichannel at a later stage of their journey or closer to launch, we don't get enough data right away to say something is working or not. So that's the second aspect of cold start in terms of measurement. And that's where I think Daniel alluded to this in a previous question. That's where the leading indicators right away become super important, right? So leading indicators, they are our best bet on what to do next when we do not have enough data, and not enough time has lapsed since kind of the deployment of Omnichannel, right? So focusing on metrics of engagement, whether that is by field or digital channels, open rates, click-through rates, are the high-value actions that we start kind of monitoring right away as soon as a campaign or an Omnichannel solution goes live. And then we have the sentiment and perception analysis. So that's where like the qualitative and quantitative feedbacks via surveys and mechanisms from HCPs and and our reps that we receive to start getting some sentiment of, is something working? Have we had like a major miss there that we need to correct for? We start looking at the key market trends right away as well, new target analysis, market share, new brand lift, and so forth. And then finally, like 6 to 9 months down the line, when we have enough data to perform like statistical lift analysis, that's where we start performing those analysis, looking at subgroups that are receiving optimal journey versus others. Are the HCPs actually moving down the funnel and doing the more rigorous kind of statistical analysis? But to answer your question on the cold start, I think the leading indicators and the sentiment and perception analysis in the first 3 to 6 months is quite key to see if something is working or not.
Yeah, I agree. The small wins, the quick wins, and giving that confidence that things are moving are very critical. Brandon, from your perspective, how are you looking at it at UCB?
Yeah, and so building on a lot of what is said, I mean, a lot of it comes down to managing expectations. And I think people are bought into the vision of omnichannel and of the machine learning capabilities and AI that can be applied to this to make just phenomenal recommendations based on the customer, but it takes time to get there, right? And I think we definitely stepped on our toes a few times with people expecting that we had machine learning right out of the gate, where we had to explain that you don't just start there. You start with rules based. You start with triggers, and so learning. It's back to the change management piece that we've talked about. It's learning about how to communicate on these things and learning about setting those expectations. We have that vision, but we also have a plan and some steps that we need to take to get there. I think the other thing that has been really helpful is, as Jane talked about, finding those pockets. I love the coalition of the willing, but finding those pockets where you have some opportunity to test things and pilot things with a captive audience. And so looking at, whether it's a next best action functionality or modular dynamic content, not trying to do that everywhere all at once, but finding ways that you can learn and teach the organization about it, but also be able to show impact. And the final thing I say is, I can't agree more with Suresh on focusing on the right metrics, and especially early on, and getting people to move away from what they may be used to with either larger brands or other markets at steady state, and focus on some of those leading indicators, some of those things that we can measure and that are meaningful early on, that can help us to drive those decisions and understand how things are working. That's been a real focus of our education and our communication, is making sure that we're focusing in on the right metrics and trying to hold off on some of the traditional metrics, which may be great in a few years, but just are where it's too early, and whether it's be in a tactic or with a brand launch. So yeah, just reiterating a lot of what has been said, and focused on how we communicate and managing those expectations of what we're actually getting and when, but not discounting the promise that we have long term.
Now, so and I think this conversation is basically telling me that there is a consensus that this is a multi-layered cake. And there are many cakes, right? Because you're talking about different brands at different maturity level, different organizations looking at different things, the promises that you're making. And I think that's one of the biggest struggles for creating a measurement framework, right? Because if the measurement of what you are measuring is different for different things, the promises that you are making to different brands, different units are different, then how do you have a consistent measurement framework? And that brings me to the other question, right? That if we think about the measurement concept in itself, how do you then think about getting brands sequentially onto the platform, adding new channels, bringing in new technologies? How do you set a good reference model? Where are you heading? How do you explain that? Any perspectives on that? Brendan, this time, let me start with you.
Yeah. Well, I back to some of the earlier conversation on what do we understand about our customer, and how do we understand both the journey, but also how the various activities and tactics that we have, how we measure the impact or the response that a given customer may have to those. And there's a tendency, we have had a tendency in the past to focus a bit too much on depth of response and kind of how much is a given customer consuming, and maybe ignore some of the breadth. And so that's something that we're trying to make sure that as we look at the different concepts and different measurement opportunities that we have, that we're looking at that how many people we are reaching in the communication objectives that we have. How effective is that communication, and maybe a little bit less on the depth, but understanding when depth is important. And so that's a concept that we have. I think the other thing that I'll note is kind of back to the understanding where you can really focus on learning about a metric or learning about a tactic and learning about how to measure that. So if you take next best action and the impact that could have, understanding where you have kind of natural test and control experiments that are going on, where you have certain regions that are not utilizing it and others that are, and looking at, okay, where do we see that effectiveness? So we're trying to take advantage of some of the naturally occurring phenomena to better understand what we're actually seeing, and teach people about how we can measure, and again, try to reinforce that we're building towards that consistency across, but that we're taking advantage of, where we see some opportunities to win in the near term.
Yep. Now I will be democratic and let me ask, who would want to go next on the same question? Jane?
Sure, I can jump in. I think part of what's so challenging about this process is also what's so exciting about it, right? Is that you're trying to figure out the way to measure something that inherently is going to be a predictive measure at best at first. And so that's, I think, part of the journey that each of these teams is going on as they get started with this measurement piece. The more, though, that you can tailor the measurement framework to the overall organization's goals, I think the better off you are. So if you think about what are the strategic imperatives for the brand, for the company, for the regions, or depending on your framework, that also, I think, something I'll just add to the mix is like making sure you're tying it back to the business strategy as opposed to just the omni-channel performance. That also makes it, I think, a little easier to talk about with folks who are farther away from omni-channel. So people in the marketing and sales leadership may find that easier to kind of consume and understand if you give it to them in the language that they're used to thinking about their business in.
Yeah, makes sense. Daniel, any perspectives from your side?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was thinking along the same lines, Jane. And I think a good measurement framework is channel agnostic. It shouldn't matter what the channels you add into the mix. You're at the end of the day, you're trying to measure the same things, right? From, again, that laddering up in terms of the leading to the lagging. And so having a good view or idea of what it is, again, from an enterprise standpoint, what do you care about? We all care about revenue because we're all for profit, right? But then in Takeda, there are also other values that we care about from a patient perspective, reputation perspective, trust, and et cetera. So if those are part of your framework, how do you move back? How do you work backwards from those strategic goals? And measure, and collect the data that you need in order to measure those things.
Suresh, your perspectives?
Yeah, not much to add beyond what has been added here. I would just kind of tie it back to your previous question on how do we look across the different, like for organizations that have multiple therapeutic areas and brands. Once we launch the first one, then we have a hammer and everything becomes a nail, right? So that's where, like, respecting and understanding, to Jane's point, the strategic imperatives for each of the brands to figure out, like, what is that fit for purpose omnichannel solution and the omnichannel measurement solution that we need to put in place for that particular brand, as opposed to just taking what we have already in place and trying to make that work across the board, right? So that's the only thing that I would add, that just tying it back to the SIs and just answering why are we looking to yes, the channels will adopt and emerge, and the technologies will emerge as well, but we don't necessarily have to use the same channels and the same technologies across the board, across all the therapeutic areas. Rather question, like, what are the SIs that we are working backward from?
I completely agree. And I think the objective ultimately is that HCP and that personalized engagement, right? So everything needs to measure up, ladder up, in that direction. So in that context, right, and Brendan, you mentioned controlled experiments, right? I think one of the ultimate vision says that we will be able to run experiments. We will see what is actually effective. And we see organizations just about starting there now. I would just like to get your views for the whole panel. What kind of controlled experiments are you already running or thinking of running? How are you estimating the success of that? In our current environment, right, it's really not much that we do in that area, right? Other industries are way ahead when it comes to these kind of things. So on controlled experiments, I just wanted to get a view from you. Maybe Suresh, we start with you.
Sure, and I think this is a big one, like across the organizations that we are looking at, that to your previous question, as we add channels, as we add more like technologies, we get the question, like, where is the lift coming from, right? So the question, how can you say that it's this incremental channel that you just added and not a function of everything else? So what we are observing across the board is that the leadership is understanding terms like causal inference and the statistical tests and so forth, and asking very specific question, and rightly so, given the amount of investment they are making, is this particular tactic, or is this decision engine or the orchestration way of doing things working or not? So that's where I think, yes, we have been doing as an industry a lot of retrospective statistical tests. The ROI marketing mix works if we have a lot of data, but then going forward, how do we get to that gold standard of having real holdout groups is something I think where the organizations are emerging. And that, in order to do that, because you're actually leaving folks out from the optimized journey, you really have to bring the organization along to show how the ends justify the means and why all of this will work together. And that's where, going to my earlier point, that this doesn't work very well if this becomes like a center of excellence kind of initiative. Rather, we have to constantly work with our marketing partners to make sure that they understand the value of doing like this rigorous holdout groups and control experiments.
Brendan, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to, we've mentioned several times the customer journey and ensuring that we have a good understanding of that. And I think Daniel, you said it, and it's been said a couple of times. A good measurement framework is one that can be applied. It can be applied across your different businesses, and for us, that's anchored in the customer journey. It's anchored in how we're moving across. It's not a new concept. It's just, but how we actually can bring some consistency there. And that's what then starts to allow, and back to your question on some of these controlled tests, if you have that consistent measurement framework, then some of these controlled tests, whether they're retrospective or they're prospective, it allows you an ability to be able to compare and contrast. We've done, the marketing mix is a helpful component of that, but then this helps lead you into what are those influence factors that are actually lead into that analysis and lead into some of those outputs. And for us, the more we focus our measurement of both digital as well as personal and traditional channels on these in that customer journey, that's what keeps us close to the marketing teams and keeps us close to the sales teams. And it creates that, that integration that is really necessary to, it can't be this bolt-on. It can't be this extra thing. True omnichannel has to be, it's omni. It involves all of it, and so that's really part of the anchor that we use to bring all of those teams together and try to keep the focus there. So for us, that's the basis of the measurement model, but it's also what enables some of the optionality testing that we're able to do.
So in the interest of time, what I would do is I'll switch to some of the questions that the audience team has asked and our production team has channeled to me. I think some questions, the first question is, what are the critical metrics an organization should monitor to assess the effectiveness of omnichannel efforts? A question from the audience, that's watching this. Daniel, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the customer view is probably at the crux of where this question is coming from, right? So you're asking what metrics or what measurements should an organization be looking at to understand whether or not omnichannel is effective or not. And we talked about linking omnichannel efforts to revenue impact, for instance, and that is, I think we talk about controlled experiments, but that's really hard to do, right? I mean, even if as strong of a case as you can make, and as much as you control for variables in an experiment, there are variables that are outside of your control, dynamics in the environment, et cetera, that will raise doubt, right? And so the question, the question I like to ask when going back to the topic of controlled experiments is, well, do you know what the dollar impact is of every rep that you have out in the field, right? How do we know what the impact of that is, right? Versus your web, versus your emails, and et cetera, right? And so I think just to go back to the answer to the question, probably the most direct impact is probably reflected in how satisfied your customers are with your engagement, right? And so I know there are various ways to do that, and there are various companies that can help do that. So I'll leave it at that. But there are ways to measure externally how your customers feel about your ability to engage with them.
Suresh, you want to take a swipe at this?
Yeah, no, I think I just can kind of go back to the standard ones to begin with, like reach and frequency. What's the fraction of targets that are being reached pre and post the deployment of a particular omnichannel program, the fractions of targets reached. Then we have engagement that we monitor. And then to Daniel's point, it's very difficult to say like what's causing what, but that's where we, from a statistical side, we do our best to kind of stratify the samples in a way that makes sense to the best of our ability. Right. And then where the rubber hits the road, that's where we have the business impact, right? So I'll be looking at our market share, the NBR exchange, again, pre versus post, and then the lift associated with each tactic and the orchestration of the tactics.
Thank you. And as I expected, we could never come to a conclusion on this topic after the time has run out. But it was a lively discussion, and thank you for sharing your perspective. I think our audience will gain immensely from this. I would request that this conversation can continue. We have our own experience zone for data analytics. I would like the audience to join our panelists in that session. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.